Hello and welcome to the Chorus and the Chaos Podcast. My name is Jack, and I am, as always, joined by Grayson and Blake, and we have a very special guest with us today, Professor Nancy Pearcey. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can see her there, and if you're just on the audio, you will hear her momentarily. So we're very excited to have her with us. We're continuing our theme in Season 2 here on common struggles of the Christian life, and we've done a number of things so far. If you've gone back, you can obviously go back and listen to those, but struggles through Christian, regular prayer, scripture reading, evangelism, so on and so forth. And we're moving into common struggles as we, in the current age, thinking very modern times as we look at questions about sexuality and gender and things of this sort. And Professor Pearcey has been kind enough to join us to talk about her new book coming out very soon, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. This will be, I'm expected to be an awesome book. I'm very much looking forward to reading it. But that'll help as we think about what masculinity is, because I would argue, and I think everyone on this call would agree, that when you think about a current struggle in our day for Christianity, and in particular men, there is a struggle in our society for men to be men, right? I would contend, and anyone feel free to chime in here, there is a growing trend and movement to make men more effeminate and kind of just remove masculinity. And I would say maybe there's even a confusion about what masculinity is, right? There may be varying different definitions. But before we do that, if you're unfamiliar with Professor Pearcey, I mentioned she's got a great book that we're very excited to look at, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. That comes out June 27th. She's written a book called Love Thy Body, which I'm going to hold up here. This is, if you can see it there, one of my favorite books, quite literally. It's fantastic. It was incredibly helpful for me thinking about, as I was not trying to understand the philosophical and scriptural kind of mindset for transgenderism, homosexuality, abortion, dealing with these issues in a very practical but also very logical and scriptural way. It's an excellent book. Other books, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, Total Truth is another one that I absolutely have loved, recommended it to a lot of people. She is a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She has been quoted by us many times on the Facebook page, the New Yorker, Newsweek, which is more impressive than us, clearly, highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists in Christianity today, and hailed by the Economist as, quote, America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. So that is a lot. Professor Pearcey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm going to have to live up to that intro.
Well, it's well worth it. Truly, your book on Love Thy Body was, we've recommended it to many people that we've come across on our Facebook page and whatnot. It has brought so much clarity and biblical truth to those topics that are so confusing for so many people in our day. In fact, I've just 2 or 3 days ago, I told my wife, because my daughter is 13, that in the very near future, in the next couple years, I'm going to try to work through her and read that book with her, because I think it's such an excellent resource on how to interpret, just understand all these things that the culture is throwing at her.
Yes, I've heard from many parents who say they are doing just that.
Yeah, I believe it. So, but anyway, let's talk about masculinity. So, Professor Pearcey, you've written a book on it, so obviously you've had a lot of time to think about masculinity and toxic masculinity. What drove you to even write on this subject?
Well, certainly, as you said in the intro, in our day, masculinity is under attack. It is being denigrated and demeaned. I start the book with several colorful examples, provocative examples, even from mainstream publications. Like the Washington Post had an article that was actually titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" I thought, really? Wow. The Washington Post? This is not a fringe publication. Or the Huffington Post, where you might expect it more, but still, an editor wrote that her New Year's resolution was to kill all men. Books have come out with titles like, "I Hate Men," "Are Men Necessary? No Good Men." You can buy T-shirts that say, "So many men, so little ammunition." And to my surprise, as I was researching it, I even found a fair number of men who are denigrating their own sex. And this was more surprising, but You may have seen the most recent one was the director of the movie Avatar. It was tweeted out. It became kind of viral, where he said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. Or and this is Hugh Howey, who is a best-selling science fiction writer, and he got on the same track. He says testosterone is the problem. Women should be in charge of everything. And there was even a book that said talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. So obviously, I did feel that we needed a response. But what really triggered my decision to write the book was finding out, digging into some of the sociological literature and finding out that Christian men break the mold. That again, Christian men are usually considered to be the worst examples, right? They're often cited as the main, exhibit A of toxic masculinity, because they do tend to, if they're theologically conservative, they tend to believe in headship in the home. And that was easy to find examples of as well, both Christians and non-Christians saying that conservative Protestantism leads to abuse. It leads to men being overbearing, tyrannical patriarchs. What else? It feeds the rape culture. Theology of male headship feeds the rape culture. So, again, my answer to that is these guys are not reading the literature of the social sciences, because sociologists and psychologists have been doing research partly in response to these criticisms. They're like, well, wait a minute, what's the evidence? You guys are throwing all these accusations out there, but what's the evidence? And so I have about a dozen sociologists and psychologists who actually did research. The trouble is it hasn't gotten out there yet. It's still hidden away in the academic literature. So I said, okay, we need to know this. It turns out that committed evangelical men, in other words, those who are really serious about their faith, who go to church regularly, test out as the most loving to their wives. And by the way, they test the wives separately, which is important. So the wives are reporting that they feel happy with the level of their husband's love and appreciation. They test out as the most engaged fathers, both in terms of shared activities like sports or church youth group, as well as discipline, like setting limits on screen time or setting bedtime.
Yeah.
They test out, evangelical family men test out as having the lowest levels of divorce, and they test out as having the lowest level of domestic violence and abuse of any group in America. And you probably say, this is what people always say to me, but wait a minute, don't Christians divorce at the same level as the rest of the culture? We've all heard this, right? I read that it is one of the most commonly cited statistics by Christian leaders,
it's very common.
which they're probably trying to motivate us. But so the researchers went back to the data, and they made a distinction between truly committed Christian men who attend church regularly versus nominal Christian men. Nominal means in name only. I went over this in my class yesterday, and most of the kids didn't. My undergrad students didn't know what nominal meant. So just to clarify, nominal means in name only. In other words, these are people who, in a survey like this, might check the Baptist box because of their cultural background and their family, but they're not really committed. They don't attend church regularly, and their attitudes are largely shaped by the secular culture. These nominal Christian men test out, according to all the negative stereotypes. They have the worst marriages. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They report the lowest level of connection with their children. They have the highest level of divorce, higher than secular men, and they have the highest rate of domestic violence and abuse of any group in America, higher than secular men. This was stunning. Yeah. So apparently these are men who kind of hang around the fringes
Wow.
of the church enough to catch language like headship and submission, but they infuse it with secular definitions like entitlement and dominance and so on. So this is why, if you put these two groups together, we've got men who are better than secular men, and we have men that are worse than secular men, both claiming the evangelical label. And so most studies just put them together, and that's why the results get skewed. So the church needs to be aware of what we're up against, that we do have a lot of men who claim the evangelical label but are not living up to it, and they're ruining the reputation for everybody else.
Yeah. I feel like all the statistics I see, and I don't have anything handy, but I couldn't just to mind. I always feel like I see this headline of something along the lines of abuse rates or divorce rates, or we'll pick the category, whatever it is, right? The same among the secular world among Christians. Like you tend to see that accusation, as you pointed out. Like it seems that's the line that people put out. But it's really encouraging because my experience would say, as a committed Christian and being in church with other evangelicals, I don't see that like in my personal life. So that makes a lot more sense, right? Because
Yes, and because you and I probably hang out mostly with committed Christian men, I don't know about you, but I thought the nominals were probably a small group. But at least one study I read, no, they're the same size. They're about the same size, numerically speaking. So that when a man claims to be evangelical, you have about a 50-50 chance of him being really committed or being nominal. But let me give you one quote, because this was in the New York Times. The main researcher, my sort of go-to sociologist, is Brad Wilcox. Brad Wilcox teaches at UVA, University of Virginia. He's I forget the name of it's marriage. Institute for Family Studies. Anyway, he is considered perhaps the top marriage researcher in the nation. And he got an article published in the New York Times. There had been an article claiming that the happiest marriages were the progressive ones. So it was written by a secular progressive. So he wrote an article saying, and by the way, this was for Valentine's Day, so that was kind of the hook. He said, well, yes.
Sorry.
He said, yes, progressive marriages are better than the average because they're actually very intentional. But he said, let me show you my evangelicals. It's a J curve. The evangelicals are even much higher than even the best of the secular marriages. And here's how he put it. I have the quote here in my notes. It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America, they're testing the wives because the charge is that these marriages are oppressive to women, right? That they silence women, that they're abusive to women. So the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Full 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. So he gets I'm amazed that the New York Times published this.
Yeah, no kidding. Wow.
So the happiest wives in America, just in terms of sheer objective empirical research, are religious conservatives who, with their husbands, hold conservative gender values. So this is astonishing.
Yeah.
This has to get out there.
Yeah. No, I can see. Wow, that's incredible. Those are incredible statistics. Truly, that is so in opposition to the mantra that's just pushed in the public about. I mean, it's the complete opposite. It's the complete opposite. Yeah.
And while we're on Brad Wilcox, since he's our top sociologist, by the way, he's Catholic, and he says evangelical Protestants do better than Catholics. So he doesn't really have a dog in this fight. He's not. It's not like an evangelical who is trying to defend evangelicals.
Right.
He wasn't out to do that. But he did write about the nominals in Christianity Today, by the way. And he did say, here it is. The most violent husbands, with the italicized, the most violent husbands in America are nominal evangelical Protestants who attend church infrequently or not at all. So he's the one who went back and made this distinction, between committed evangelicals and nominals.
Yeah.
And this is what he's found. So this is kind of what we're up against in trying to understand these issues in the church, is that we have both the best and the worst out there. So we should really, continue to support the men who are doing well. In fact, here's another quote from Brad Wilcox. It's so cool. He's talking to the secular critics, because most secular researchers are critics of evangelicalism or any form of religious conservatism. And he says to them, you need to overcome your prejudices. That's how he puts it. You academics need to overcome your prejudices, because in fact, evangelical men do a great job. And then here's what's so interesting. Now, you and I, it would seem obvious that if you're committed and go to church regularly, but what the pushback I've gotten and the pushback that he got as well, Brad Wilcox, was, well, maybe this is selection effect. Maybe it's good guys who go to church in the first place. But that would lead to the question, why are good guys attracted to church?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. But actually, Wilcox says, no, my findings are that church itself does have an impact. It's kind of funny because he's explaining this to secular academics, saying things that we think are just obvious. But he says to them, look, at church, you get a message that men should be loving to their wives, that men should take care of their children. After all, these are souls bound for eternity. It's one place where you find messages reinforcing being a good husband and father. It's the one place where you find other men who are interested in, who will affirm your values of being being invested in your family. And then he says, you don't find it at work, you don't find it at the pool hall, you don't find it at that local saloon or tavern. He said, really, church is probably the only institution in America where you still get messages that support men who want to be good husbands and fathers.
Yep. Yeah, especially in our day and age. I mean, literally anywhere you go, you get the message of the opposite often, right? You get the me-centered universe where everything's about your happiness or your own soul care, so to speak. Church is a place where they'll continually stretch you and push you towards actually pursuing righteousness and pursuing Christ's righteousness within the home.
Exactly. And like I said, that's what he found. Here's another way of thinking of it. This is another sociologist, but I have to tell you guys, this is the most controversial book I've written. I didn't think it would be. I would think Love Thy Body would be, because issues like abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism. But in fact, at least in Christian,
you really went for it in that book, Professor Pearcey, I'll tell you.
No holds barred. Huh?
That's right.
Gloves were off. Yeah.
And yet, I do have to, for people who haven't read it, I have to qualify that by saying the most frequent compliment that I get on that book is it's so compassionate.
It is.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And so, based on what we just said, someone who hasn't read it might think it's kind of polemical and harsh and sharp-edged, and it's not. So it manages to be, very, very direct, and yet at the same time compassionate, and with lots of stories. Now that I'm a professor at a university, I get lots of personal stories from my students. People who read it say, you must talk a lot to your students, because I get a lot of their stories in there. And, that kind of brings it to life. That makes it personal when you see how it's fleshed out. And this book, too, the Book of Masculinity, is also has a lot of anecdotes. But I'll tell you why it's been controversial. So my young female students are mostly feminists, even in a Christian university. And if I said anything positive about men, they would get triggered.
Quick question. Do you think they're knowingly feminist? Like, would they self-proclaim that? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know if they were culturally feminist. They just kind of have that air. If they were like, no, this is who I am.
A lot of them will say, I am.
Yeah. Okay.
But although I'm trying to think of some examples. I have some examples where the person the young student did not claimed to be feminist, I still got triggered. If I said anything good about men, well, women do that too, Well, yes, men are strong. Women are strong too. So that kind of took me by surprise. I did have some more progressive students who would get triggered when I said anything positive about men. And then I had male students who felt beaten down and discouraged and demeaned. And here's an example. When I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, one male student shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us," just like that. So I got, and then I would get people saying, the first question everyone had, whose side is she on? Like, wait a minute, I'm just trying to be objective and biblical. I'm not taking sides.
Right.
That's one of the things I've always appreciated about your books is you stick to the facts, you stick to what the scriptures say, and you're looking at it, trying to say, here's what, just from an objective viewpoint, this is what it says, and this is what the data shows. And so what we have to do is reconcile with that, and our idea or concept of truth and metaphysics, all that stuff has to comport with reality.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
We are reality oriented.
Yes.
To use a phrase that was big in the last election, we are reality oriented. And so often people's first question was, whose side is she on? And so in my first chapter, I've got to disarm both sides, right? I've got to disarm them. And like Grayson said, bring them back to, we want to approach this objectively. And one of the things that was the most helpful was I found a study by a sociologist, not a Christian, who said, there are actually two competing scripts for men. And here's how he explained it. He said he asks questions. He's spoken all around the world. He's a very famous sociologist. And he said, when he speaks to young men, he asks them two questions. First, he asks them, what does it mean to be a good man? If you go to a funeral and in the eulogy they say he was a good man. Well, men had no problem answering that. They said integrity, self-sacrifice, take care of those you love, look out for the little guy. I like that one.
Yeah.
Look out for the little guy. Stand up for justice, protect and provide, and so on. And this was universal all around the world, from Australia to Switzerland to, South America. And he would say, well, where did you get that? How do you know that? And they would say, well, that's just in the air. That's in the air we breathe. Right? That's just how we're raised. And in the West, they would often say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage.
Yeah.
And then he would follow up and he'd say, well, what if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young man would say, oh, no, that's very different. That's not the same at all. That means, in fact, let me see if I can find my notes on that one, because that one's, I have to give you their exact words, because they said, oh, that's completely different. That means be tough, strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid. And that helped when we realized that men have these two competing scripts in their head. It helps us to realize, well, the debate, I say, is not really between men and women. The debate is between these two scripts that are both in men's own heads, because it seems that everywhere, people are made in God's image. So men everywhere do recognize the script for the good man. Mm-hmm. They do in every culture. They understand that. In fact, there was the first anthropologist who ever did a cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity. Not of men, but of concepts of masculinity. What do they think a man should be? What's their ideal for manhood? And he found that universally, men are expected to fulfill what he calls the 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate, which means raise a family. Yeah. Universal. Mm-hmm. So men do, recognize they are made in God's image. They know what the good man is. But culture is constantly pressuring them to live up to the real man, man up, be a real man. So the good man versus the real man. When I put that at the beginning of the book, I found a lot of people kind of relaxed. Okay, you're not going to defend men wholesale and ignore problems of abuse and so on, but you're not going to attack men. You're not some raving man-hating feminist either. You're going to acknowledge that both of these two scripts are out there. And now the question is, how do we support men in living out the ideal of the good man, which they already hold?
Yeah.
That's the real goal. How do we support men in living out what they already know because they're made in God's image?
Yeah, it's an interesting point because those are really two competing scripts for what masculinity is. And I think as a father, because I have 5 children, my oldest is 13, I mentioned her earlier, but I have 3 boys, and I'm constantly thinking about them and trying to help them understand, that phrase, be a man, be a man, grow up and exhibit manhood, helping to define to them what that is. Our culture has confused that so much. And even in the terms of masculinity, right? You have these two competing scripts. Growing up in a world without any type of clarity, thankfully, as a father, I'm trying to bring that, obviously. But for a lot of kids out there growing up without that clarity, how confusing and difficult must that be? It's
right.
It's tragic in a lot of ways with the age that our men and our young boys are growing up in.
Yeah, I do spend some time in the first chapter laying out kind of what men are up against today and how boys and men are falling behind on many different counts. Here we are in a culture that attacks men, but in fact, men are doing worse than they have in the past. Boys are falling behind in education at all stages, from kindergarten to graduate school. Boys are falling behind. I teach at a Christian university. And when I first came here, we were about 70-30, 70% female and 30% male. And we've been working really hard to get it closer. The average, though, in America on university campuses is 60-40.
Women to men?
So, yes,
Yeah.
60% women, 40% men. And more women than men graduate. More women than men graduate from graduate school. More women than men even graduate from professional schools like law school. And veterinary school. So in education, and there are like 4 times as many scholarships for women as for men. So, meanwhile, every university, secular university campus has a women's center aimed at deconstructing male power when it's actually men who are now falling behind. And it's true that men still end up being in positions like president and CEO and Hollywood's film director and so on. But that's a very small minority of men.
Right.
That on average, men are actually going. In fact, even work. Studies show that we are at depression level unemployment. It's just not showing up because so many of these men have given up looking, so it doesn't show up in the statistics anymore. Men are dropping out of the workforce and their life expectancy is going down. In the last 4 years or so, their life expectancy has gone down while women's has stayed the same. So I think we do need to start asking, what can we do to help men?
Yeah.
We've had wonderful programs to help women succeed in the workplace and education, especially. We put a lot of money and effort into helping women succeed, and that's great because they weren't even in it. They weren't even admitted to a lot of universities until the mid-20th century. So they've made great strides, and we should applaud that. But now we need to also realize that men are falling behind, and they need help, especially in the younger grades, because their natural abilities are not as suited. They're not as verbal, and they don't have the fine motor control that you need to color and use the scissors,
Right.
in kindergarten.
Right.
So already in kindergarten, they're falling behind. So, I think that it's time for our culture as a whole to start saying, what can we do to help men?
Yeah.
You mentioned, or at least from what I understand within the book itself, you mentioned the idea that many of these pervading thoughts as far as what toxic masculinity is, how the cultural viewpoint affects this, began much, much earlier than what we see today. And so that's a question I had, is just if you could expand on that a little bit more. But also, perhaps I'm speaking completely out of ignorance, but do you see in any way that like Darwinian theory plays into this stuff as well?
Yeah, but I'd like to treat those as two separate questions.
Sure,
but yes, definitely. The bigger historical pattern is this. It goes all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, men worked alongside their wives and children in family farms, on family farms, in family industries. And so they were working with people they loved and had a moral bond with. Mm. And so the cultural expectation on men was much more of a caretaking role, that you had to be gentle and kind because you're working with your family. And you were expected to, well, the slogan at the time was duty to God and man, so you're duty driven. And you expected not only to be a good father, but also a common phrase back then was father of the community. So you're supposed to have a fatherly relationship to your surrounding community as well. And of course, men still had to have the sort of traditional male characteristics because they were making their way in a wilderness. So they still had to have resilience and strength and courage, because there were always new fields to plow, new businesses to start, and so on. But the cultural expectation was you weren't doing that for you were doing that for your family. It wasn't an individual aggressiveness kind of ideal. At the Industrial Revolution, what it did is it took work out of the home and into factories and offices. And of course, men had to follow their work out of the home. And for the first time, they were not working with people that they loved. They were not working with family members. They were working as individuals in competition with other men. Well, how do you think that would change the script for men? Already you see, in the 19th century, people began to complain. I mean, they didn't like the change they were seeing, but they began to complain that men were becoming self-assertive, aggressive, egocentric, acquisitive, greedy. Language like that began showing up for the first time, really, as people said, and then in addition to that, they were away from their family all week, which was a first.
I was actually just thinking of that, where, we look at the epidemic of fatherlessness today and how many fathers are, even the ones that are at home, are often negligible. It literally just connected the dots in my head of saying that makes sense considering they've been removed from the home due to work, whereas they're around 24/7 before, no longer.
Exactly. It made a huge change. So first of all, you see the rhetoric change. You see a much more negative construction of the male character as people protested that men were no longer connected to their family and they were becoming individualistic and their work was becoming their idol. I have some quotes from literature at the time saying, their work is their idol and success and money has become their idol. The American man is losing his soul, as a contemporary journalist put it. So that's now that continues through several stages. And in the book, I trace some of those stages. And your second question about Darwinism is one of those stages, because certainly Darwinism had a huge impact on the view of men in particular. Because for a couple of reasons. One is instead of seeing your spirit, your soul, your moral will as sort of the dominant part of who you are, Darwin said, no, it's your animal nature. That's who you really are. That's the core of who you are. The animal instincts and impulses. So the goal for men was not to aspire, to spiritual goals. The goal for men began to be get in touch with your animal nature, with your, biological impulses for lust and power. You start to see that in the literature of the day. The main popularizer of Darwinism here in America was Herbert Spencer. And he literally said, in the struggle for existence, the men who came out on top were tough, mean, and even predatory. And so those are the characteristics that natural selection has selected for in men. And you say, well, how do women get along with such predatory men? And he said, well, it would help if they developed the capacity to please. And they also need to learn to hide their distress at mistreatment. So that was the message from Darwinism. And I should add that Darwin himself wrote that females were inferior to males, that they're intellectual capacity and everything was lower. He did acknowledge that they had more sympathy, more emotional empathy, but he said, but those are characteristics of the lower species. So even women's good traits were seen as signs of her inferiority. So Darwin also had a huge impact on inspiring a sort of disrespect for women. The language at the time was like this. Think of Tarzan. This is when Tarzan came out, by the way. The Tarzan books are incredibly popular because what did they do? They showed a man who was raised by the animals and who kind of kept that beast within. And so even the literature of the day, there was also a literary genre called literary naturalism. And the naturalists were they were all Darwinists.
Interesting.
And they were giving literary form to a Darwinist worldview. So these would be people like the best known as Jack London, who everybody reads in high school. But Jack London read Spencer, who I just mentioned, and Darwin, and had a full-blown conversion to a materialistic worldview, and intentionally was trying to communicate a Darwinian worldview in his stories. You and I didn't know that when we read Call of the Wild. But
right.
That, the literary historians are very clear that this is what his intention was. And so that's why we need to read even literature with our worldview antenna out. Yeah. He wrote about dogs to kind of cover his tracks, but he really was intending his message to be about humans. That humans are just products of genetics and environment with no free will, governed by the laws of natural selection. So, and another common phrase at the time was, we are a beast under a thin veneer of civilization. That was the phrase, thin veneer of civilization. And so to be a real man meant to get back in touch with those, biological impulses. So, and you'll find that today. Go to the manosphere, go to places like the manosphere where there are these groups that I even had a Christian student. I gave this talk at a student group once, and a male Christian student stood up and said, "Well, shouldn't we be recovering our internal animal nature?" And I thought, okay, this guy's been on the manosphere.
Right.
So anyway, I think this is still a big part of the concepts of the real man that are influencing so many people today. And the other side of it is, now you started out saying you think our culture is feminizing men. They're really both, because on the one hand, you do see the impact of Darwinism still, where people think, well, the way to recover being a man is to be rough and tough. And you remember the definition of the real man. Get rich, get laid. I had to make sure you knew that was a quote, not my own words.
Right.
But
we don't want that one to show up as a Professor Pearcey quote on the page.
Good point. But the other side of it is, I'll tell you where the roots of that are. The idea that, in a sense, we're feminizing men. That also has historical roots. When the Industrial Revolution took men out of the home, well, who filled in? Who filled in for them? Mothers, female teachers. And so for the first time in American history, boys were being raised primarily by women. And the leading psychologist of the day actually has a colorful quote where he says, "Never in American history have boys been so wild and so half-orphaned." Half-orphaned. His point was, the fathers are gone, so they're half-orphaned. And so there was a lot of concern about this, that boys were being raised without their father's guidance and their father's discipline and so on. And what discipline and structure they did get was from women. Well, as a result, they began to treat structure and moral guidelines as feminine. These are things women impose. And to be a real boy, which is the counterpart to the real man, to be a real boy meant to rebel against those structures, to rebel against these feminine standards. In fact, there was a new word that entered the American vocabulary. I don't know if you've heard of it. People began to use the word over-civilized. Have you heard that one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. My students hadn't, but yeah, I figured you might. Over-civilized. The idea was that boys were growing up soft and effeminized, and that we needed to do something to help them recover their manhood. And part of this also came out of the reform movements of the 19th century. In the 19th century, with urbanization, with the factory system and big cities growing and a public sphere growing, that was factories, banks, academia, industry, and so on. Many people began to say, well, the public realm should be value free. What we hear today, right? Don't bring your private values into the public realm.
Right.
That's when that started. And so this public realm was being secularized. And since men worked in the public realm, they became secular earlier than women did. And so people began to say, well, the public realm should be value free. Where do we preserve values? I mean, we still want to preserve the things that are no longer appropriate in the public realm, like love and altruism and affection and spiritual devotion and piety and so on. Well, they were relegated to the private realm. And then who would be in charge of them? Well, women, because women were in the private realm. So for the first time in human history, it started to be said that women were morally superior to men, morally and spiritually superior to men. I just want to press upon you, because this double standard is very common today. I saw it just earlier today. I saw a what was it? I was flipping through articles on YouTube, on the internet, so you don't always remember where it was. But two of the questions in this survey were, women are purer than men, and women are morally superior to men. And I thought, there's an example. It had never been said before the 19th century. Ever since the ancient Greeks, the insight between right and wrong was thought to be a rational insight. And men are thought to be more rational, and therefore men are more moral. In fact, you know what the Latin root of the word virtue is? Virtue?
None of him.
V-I-R. It means man. Virtue meant manly strength and honor. That's what virtue meant. It's like the word virile, right? Which means manly. So virtue actually was thought to be a male trait up until the 19th century. So this was dramatically new, that for the first time, women were seen as morally superior. As the public realm was secularized and men became more secular in their perspective. And also male behavior, well, if they're becoming more secular, their behavior does begin to grow worse, especially young men. Young men are coming into the city and leaving behind structures of accountability like family, church, village. Right. And so in the 19th century, you see a great increase in drinking, gambling, fighting, prostitution, what else? All the sort of traditional male vices. And that's why in the 19th century, there was a huge a response to that was a ballooning of reform movements. But who led those reform movements? Women did. Yeah. And so once again, you've got this sense of, well, women are more superior, and it's women who have to call men out. Here's how let's see if I can remember it. There's one historian who puts it really succinctly. She said, there was little doubt as to the sex of the tavern keepers, the seducers, the slave masters, etc. In other words, the reform movements all had sort of an undercurrent of condemnation of males. So the tension between men and women grows, and men began to say, well, being moral, being virtuous means being effeminate. And so you get these two, on the one hand, men are concerned that they're growing more soft and effeminate because they're being raised by women. And then they counter that by trying to be more masculine. And that's where Darwin comes in. On the timeline, 1859, that's where Darwin comes in and supports the notion that, yes, men really are brutes under the skin.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, Professor Pearcey, talking about the preventing toxic behavior in men. I think we'd all be in agreement, and I think one of the thrusts of your forthcoming book is for fathers really to invest deeply into their sons. What are some of the practical steps that fathers can take really to be more involved in their sons, the lives of their sons, really in the lives of their daughters also, particularly in this world that is giving a contrary message to that?
Yeah, I mean, everybody knows that fathers are ridiculed and mocked in the media today.
Right.
They're always, the dimwit dad.
That's an interesting insight that actually, when I was growing up, one of the things, and that was first brought to my mind actually by my grandmother, one of the things that she hated the most about television was the portrayal of the
Homer
dimwit
Simpson
dad. Yeah, I mean, but even back in her day of television, that the father was, kind of the dummy, and the husband was kind of the dummy and was the butt of the jokes and everything. So that's really interesting that you brought that forward. That just kind of sprung in my mind, like the thing that used to irritate my grandmother.
Yeah, it irritates me too. And nowadays everybody knows that. It's so common.
Right.
And so where does this come from? I mean, we know it's there, but nobody knows where it came from. Again, it's back to the Industrial Revolution. When fathers had to leave the home to work, they were no longer in close contact with their family throughout the day. They were no longer aware of their kids' needs. They were no longer aware of what was kind of the household dynamics. And so right from almost the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, fathers began to be portrayed as incompetent in the home. As
Gotcha.
Isn't that, see, doesn't make sense?
It does, yeah.
It's just grown worse since then, but all the way back to the beginning. I have quotes in my book from the 19th century where people began to say, what does a father really do anyway? What's the purpose of a dad? What does he accomplish? What does he add to the family besides a paycheck? You start to see that language all the way back then. And so it's just gotten worse over time. So the answer then is, you can't write a book like this without offering some solutions. So I do have a whole chapter on practical solutions. Like, we can't reverse the Industrial Revolution, but are there ways that we can adapt the work structure so that men can do some of their work at home, so that they could have a flexible schedule? And it's largely anecdotal. I talk about men who started home-based businesses. And sometimes it's as little as a man that I interviewed said, well, I leave work at 4:30 2 days a week to coach my son's soccer and basketball team. And and his boss got on him about that. He told him he was what did you say? You're coasting. You're coasting. You're not really working hard. Well, it didn't really hurt him professionally. And as his kids got older, they said, we want to be a dad like you,
that's great.
Which is a lot better than any workplace award.
That's a high compliment.
Oh yeah, 100%.
So I do give a lot of stories. And this is not in the book because it just came out, so I'll have to tell it to you. New York Times just ran an article a few weeks ago on how so many men during the pandemic said that they got closer to their children and they don't want to lose it. I thought, what a wonderful story in the New York Times. So that's what I tried to capture in one of my chapters was, and the pandemic helped. It did help because it gave me a lot of stories. One of my graduate students was married to an IT professional who started working at home during the pandemic. He started participating more in the homeschooling. He started making some of the family meals. He started making lunch every day. He was there to take the kids to soccer. He picked up so much of the family responsibilities that his wife was an opera singer. My student was an opera singer. And she started a voice studio. And so the whole family benefited from the additional income as well. And the time that he used to spend commuting, he and his wife now spend praying together.
Oh, wow.
So he said to me, I interviewed him and he said, I am never going back to a cubicle. Our whole family is so much more balanced. So it can be done. It's mostly anecdotal because it's almost up to each father to work it out with his workplace. But I gave a lot of examples to help people, to help them think creatively about ways that they might be able to do it in their circumstance.
Yeah, I found that. So because I work in the software industry, and when the pandemic happened, a lot of, most of my time is spent answering email. So I could easily do that from home. So I work from home full time, and I wouldn't go back for anything, because, the kids get home, and by the time you add the commute on either end of a work, I mean, and I have young children, so the actual amount of time with kids on a daily basis is thin. Because if I get off work at 5 and there's a 30-minute commute, by the time you have, dinner, prayer, all that stuff, you're talking with young kids, hour and a half, 2 hours before you have to start getting ready and thinking about bed. And that's just such a small period of time. And now I can take breaks in the day. I don't have the commute. If I don't have a meeting for a couple hours, I can go downstairs or have an extended lunch with the kids and things like that. So there's a noticeable difference in our home, just from me. It wasn't by choice, but I'm so thankful in the Lord's providence it happened that way. So.
Yeah, there was one study that said 65% of men say they don't want to go back, not full time. They don't, they want to be able to work at least part of the time from home. 65%. And in this survey, it was college-educated fathers who led the way, which I thought was interesting.
That is. One other question for you before we begin to wrap things up here, and I'm just curious of your thoughts on this. There's so much false narrative about masculinity and toxic masculinity and out there. Why do you think our culture continues to perpetuate that? When, clearly, as you've shown it, obviously, I know the statistics aren't widely out there. You've had to dig for them. But why do you think our culture perpetuates this false narrative when these things are demonstrably false? You can see it.
I think that we have to chalk a lot of it up to secularization. As our culture has become more secularized, I start my book, in the pre-industrial revolution, so the colonial era. And part of that is because people say, well, what about, Asia? What about, wait, I can only write one book. So to limit it, I kept it to America. I did keep it to America. But secondly, it gave me a really good opportunity to contrast a Christian view with a secular view, because the early Americans were primarily Christians. The culture was very Christian. And so I could show the gradual secularization. And as America secularized, the definition of manhood did go down. We've already talked about Darwin, so that would be a prime example, though, where people began to say, well, we're no longer holding up an ideal of man, of being godly and loving and caring, and having integrity, self-sacrifice. No, it's get ahead, look out for number one. And there was actually a turning point. This was an important turning point. So during the 19th century, like I said, there were all these reform movements. So we're talking about, there were the temperance movement. I'll give you a specific fact. Sometimes one fact helps you to have a peg to hang this on. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today. So alcoholism was huge. And that's why there was a temperance movement. There was a reason. Public drunkenness, was of a big problem. People falling down in the streets in drunken stupors. And domestic violence, of course, went way up because husbands were coming home drunk. And poverty was up because men were spending their money on alcohol instead of spending it on their families. So the temperance movement, there's a reason for that reform movement. And of course, there were also other movements against gambling and against prostitution and against, slavery, of course, the abolition movement. So there were all of these movements. But as I said, they tended to focus on what were traditionally male vices. And there was a turning point. This was about the time of Darwin. There was a turning point where men began to say, I'm tired of being painted as a villain. I'm going to just take all these accusations and say, okay, fine. That is the real man. Fine. This is my identity. So this was an important turning point where, at least in the secular mind, they basically accepted all of the negative definitions of men as, more prone to vice, more prone to sin, more prone to moral failure, more prone to drink and gamble and have sex. I mean, especially in relation to sex and alcohol. They just said, okay, fine, that is the male character. So that was kind of the transition from the good man still being held as the ideal, and the real man being accepted as, well, this is the ideal. So as our culture secularized, it moved. I'm glad we started with that distinction, because now people know what we mean. The good man was eclipsed for the real man, and that's why. And so you say, so why do we have this negative view? Because most people think today, at least secular people, mostly define masculinity by those more toxic characteristics of dominance and entitlement and control and power over instead of support under. There are an awful lot of people who define it that way. And of course, as culture has become more secular, things like domestic violence have increased. And so there are more and more women who have experienced various forms of violence, whether it's, before marriage, things like rape and sexual assault, or after marriage, domestic violence and abuse have gone up. But I think we need to say we need to lay it at the door of secularism,
right?
And that it has encouraged a much more negative definition of masculinity.
Yeah, the church needs to, just in general, do a better job of addressing that, I think, just broadly through discipleship and Christian education and things of that sort too. Helping, and I'm kind of thinking out loud here, this wasn't something I've critically thought a lot about, but it seems to me that that's something the church could do and maybe should do through discipleship and Christian education to help aside from what Scripture plainly teaches, help our generation coming up see the problems of what secularization is doing as it relates to clearly gender confusion, all these things, right? Sexuality, but specifically toxic masculinity, because that's the leadership of the future, right? We as a church, as the church, we need strong men who embody those things of strong, high character, Christ-like character.
Right. It's the the Christ-likeness of it.
The church, not that the church isn't doing that at all, but I think it should be maybe something for people to think about, that the church needs to be very focused on that, helping develop Christ-like men as they grow up, because this pervasive toxic masculinity thread within the culture that's out there right now, it's just so confusing. I think it's so confusing for so many people and young boys and young men growing up, because they don't know what reality is. There's just, they don't have without the example, it can be really hard to enact that.
On the other hand of it too, you find people, you hear the word like meek, right? Galatians 5 talks about this idea of meekness, and people often picture it as a timid, shy, unmanly type of person, right? That has to embrace that. But the reality of what meekness is, biblically defined, is strength under control. So that proper strength is harnessed in a time of need when it's actually appropriate. So I think of the contrast between that and how Proverbs would define essentially the animalistic man. He is a brute, a senseless being, no better than the animals of the field or the oxen. And so what we have really are two disparate ends of the spectrum in our society today, where they're happy kind of to fall in one of two ditches. And what we're at least trying to do biblically, as we're looking at this anecdotally and also just logically as we're presenting data and saying, here's what reality is we're carving out a path that perhaps has been abandoned for some time. But thankfully, it's still nothing that's ultimately new, right? There's still that Ecclesiastes reality that there's nothing new under the sun. Nancy, I think you hit it wonderfully when you were talking about just these ideas of virtue, right? They were cultivated in the home by fathers and as a team with their wives. And it was a centered home, and not a child-centered home, but a centered home around this idea of piety. Ultimately, do good to neighbor and ultimately do good to your God. We've lost that today, but how do we return to it? But by going back to those same Judeo-Christian roots that we've had for millennia, but they've been ignored or pushed off to the side, so to speak.
Yeah, and the church has kind of the same split, by the way. You have people who argue that the church is patriarchal and doesn't listen to women. And then you have men who often feel like they have to leave their masculinity at the door.
Right.
We have kind of the same split in the church, and that which is not surprising. We tend to reflect the culture, unfortunately. But as a result, I think you're right. We don't have a clear understanding of masculinity in the church that avoids those two extremes.
Well, Professor Pearcey, thank you so much, because we're about out of time. Thank you so much for sitting down with us. I was excited about your book before, and now I'm like, I can't wait to to read it. It's going to be fantastic.
Right. Same.
I did want to give you just a second. If there's anything else you wanted to say about how people can connect with you or find out more about your book, if there's anything else you wanted to offer out there about how they can find you or your book, anything of that sort, just give you a moment to speak to that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, I do have a website, though it's being updated for this book, but I do have one, nancypearcey.com. But I also want to say you can pre-order the book. It does help. It helps the rankings when there are a lot of pre-orders. So it's a way of letting Amazon and other bookstores know that we want this kind of content. So if you have a chance to before the book comes out, do consider pre-ordering it on Amazon or whatever your favorite bookstore is.
Okay. Yeah. So the book again, the title of it, if you're sitting at home by your computer, The Toxic War on Masculinity: How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. And I'll, of course, for anyone listening out there or on YouTube, I'll put a link to all that in the show notes so you can find it. But thanks again, Professor Pearcey. This has been an honor and very, very educational and enlightening, to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely.
But thank you. It's great talking with you
Thanks
guys.
so much for listening. This has been the Chorus and the Chaos Podcast. Until next time.